Welcome to our YouTube channel, where wisdom meets inspiration. In this channel, we share valuable insights to help you become the best version of yourself.
Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Our subject today is dealing with disappointment. Sooner or later, especially as we grow older, we realize that we are going to be disappointed sometime or the other in life. That not everything is going to go the way we wanted it to. Some things yes, but some other things no. And when things don't go the way we expected them to go or we hoped they would go, then we feel disappointed. Now, not everyone handles disappointment in the same way. One natural, we might think, even think a very human response would be we are going to be sad, we are going to be sometimes depressed, sometimes we might start searching for who to blame, why the things didn't go the way they did, and so on. One of the ways that we find we can deal with disappointment a little better is once we begin to accept that life, there will be disappointments, then when a disappointment comes, we will not feel that something very terrible, something very unusual has happened in my case. Especially when we realize everyone in the world is disappointed sometime or the other. So it's a kind of a human malady, if you like. Also, we sooner or later learn to get over our disappointments because there is often this unexpressed hope or a dream that, well, I have a setback now, but better days will come. Things in future will be better than how they appear to be at present. One other way sometimes people try to fight off disappointment is through just busy themselves with work. Sometimes work itself can become enough of a distraction to help us not think about the things we don't want to think about. And sometimes, of course, people then try also to, sometimes addictions become possible. People who are not able to deal with the sorrow that comes from disappointments in life may turn to find solace through different kinds of addictions. And our entire lives may pass through dealing with our disappointments in one of these many ways. One other thing that people realize sometime or the other is the value of forbearance, what in Vedanta they say titiksha. Holy Mother once said that one who forbears survives. One who does not forbear is destroyed. In other words, there are going to be things in our lives sometimes from very unexpected sources and unexpected ways that are not going to be very happy. That's going to be very unpleasant. And unless I have learned the way of forbearing, enduring it, and again, not with some grudge and anger inside, because that hurts us more than it hurts anybody else. But if I can endure it peacefully, recognizing that it's just a part of life, then that kind of a practice of forbearance can be really helpful in life. In fact, it's one of the necessary qualities even for the practice and study of Vedanta. Since so much disappointment are so much a part of our life, sometimes people have wondered whether is there any permanent solution to the problem, or we are just kind of doomed to be disappointed sometime or the other, or is there a way to get out of it? And that naturally brings us to the field of spirituality, that all this, the idea of a transcendent being, God, the divine reality, is that if I turn to that reality for help, would that help me get over disappointment? Is there some solution to disappointment there? One thing we sooner or later realize, of course, that not all who are disappointed turn to God, but all those who do turn to God are usually disappointed in something or the other. And because one thing is clear, that if everything is fine, sometimes I've heard people say, oh, I'm so fine, I have no problem of any kind. And my feeling is, if that is true, if I have no problem of any kind, we don't need religion, we don't need God. That we turn to spirituality in some way is a admission of the reality, whether or not we consciously accept it or not, that something is not right. A lot of things in our lives may be very right and perfect the way we wanted them to, but there is something missing, something lacking. It's only when we lack something that we go in search to find a solution to that. The search for God, the search for the divine, the search for the transcendent become necessary, because at some point we realize there is some piece. We may not exactly know what it is, but something is missing. And therefore, some kind of a disappointment is possible. In fact, Swami Brahmananda, in that great book of conversation called The Eternal Companion, he says, cultivate divine discontent. So if we are disappointed for a spiritual reason, then that's a different kind of disappointment than the many other kind of disappointments we are familiar with. Now, one of the things that to verify whether something makes sense or not. So, for instance, turning to God to deal with our disappointment. Would this proposition make sense or not? The traditional way to deal with this is to turn to three sources. They call it Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhuti. In other words, turn to a reasoning, turn to scripture, and turn to experience. And if all these three match, then we can say there may be some truth in that statement. Now, as far as experience is concerned, we can consult historical sources. We find that the first chapter of the Gita itself, that Arjuna turns to Krishna's help because he is terribly disappointed in the kind of situation Arjuna was put into at the beginning of the war. And so he turns to God. We see in the life of Buddha, when we're looking at Buddha's life, and many of you have read it also, have seen how when he goes out for the first time from the palace and looks at the world outside and the sights that meet him, sight of an aging person, someone who is dead, someone who is ailing, and these are the sights that kind of create a profound movement in his heart. It's kind of a great disappointment. And that is when then he moved out to find an answer to the question of sorrow or suffering. We see that in the life of Ramakrishna also, that when he was a very young boy, we see him as a very cheerful little boy. And it's a small little village he grew up in. But then at the age of 9 or 10, when his father passed away, and we read in his life how that became a kind of a turning point, that he suddenly became more thoughtful, he started spending time more quietly, and then trying to figure out what's happening, what does life mean, what does death mean. So there are these turning points in our lives, and sometimes these turning points take the form of a kind of disappointment, one way or the other. which have made people turn to God. Experientially, we can see actually from our own lives as well. If we see ourselves as serious spiritual seekers, there is a distinction that can be made between kind of a pious religiosity and a dynamic spirituality. One way to kind of distinguish that. So, by and large, there are more people who are religious, but just periodically attending a religious service, now and then reading a little book, or occasionally observing some of these religious festivals. It's good, of course it's good. But then that does not necessarily mean that one spends some time every day in prayer, meditation, taking life, seeing spirituality not as something that spices up the rest of my life. Since we have so many interests in life, there is politics, there is sports, there is this, there is that, a little bit of religion kind of makes the plate complete. So that could be one way people turn to religion. But for some time or the other, we might find that religion or spirituality may not remain only just one little part of our life, that we begin to see how vitally important it is for our life itself. So if we look at our lives and say, when did I start taking spiritual life seriously? What is it that made me turn to this? And many of us, if with sufficient amount of self-introspection, might be able to find something that may have occurred in my life, something that we might have experienced in our lives, which suddenly made us take a deeper interest in matters related to God and spirituality. And the textual reference we can turn to is actually a couple of verses in the Gita, where Krishna is dealing exactly with this disappointment, different kind of disappointments. It occurs in the 7th chapter of the Gita, verse 16. This is how it goes. Chaturvidha bhajante mam janaha sukrutena arjuna arto jitnyasu artharthi jnani cha bharatarshabha. So Krishna is saying that 4 kinds of people turn to God. These are the 4 categories he gives. The first he says is artha, that is the distressed or the relief seeker. The second is artharthi. You can translate it as an enjoyment seeker. All of them are seekers. Third is jitnyasu, the knowledge seeker. And the fourth, he says, is jnani, which we can simply translate as a spiritual seeker. Now, all of these are disappointed in one way or the other, a disappointed lot. But what their suffering is really that has caused that disappointment is for different reasons. Now, these categories are not mutually exclusive. It's not as if we have to be either one of any of these. We might find traits of all these different in our own lives. So let's look at them one by one, just to have some clarity. So the first is called artha, a relief seeker, one who is disappointed by a lot of afflictions that have come in their lives. So this person is suffering from either physical or mental pain. And that could be either due to a very serious kind of ailment or disease, or a lack of good medical care. It can be due to tension in the family, and where reconciliation seems impossible, or the suffering could be trying to give up some addiction and it's frustrated by failure, or it could be the business is slacking, or someone is laid off from work, or unpaid credit card debt, some of the kind of things that can happen in the lives of anyone. Or it could be dealing with the loss of a loved one, or feeling empty, lonely, and so on. And so whoever is experiencing any of these can feel that pang of suffering within, and then they would want some way to overcome that suffering. And those who turn to God, so that's what Krishna is referring to here. Those who turn to God for the removal for any of these kind of physical or mental pain is the first type. He calls it the artha. The second type of people who turn to God because of disappointment, they are called artharthi. They are the artha means meaning. Arthi means one who seeks it. Now, usually we find those things that add some meaning to our life as artha. That is the thing we seek in life. We wouldn't seek anything unless we added some meaning to our lives. So that a person who seeks the things that bring that satisfaction, that joy, that enjoyment, that person is called an enjoyment seeker because these unfulfilled desires that we have. Now, because worldly prosperity makes the fulfillment of most desires possible, the artharthi can be translated also as a prosperity seeker. If I find that the dominant trait of my life, of my personality is I somehow want to be prosperous. And well, it's possible to be prosperous by cheating people and through worldly means. But if someone is a religious person, a spiritual person, may have an apparently worldly goal, but in order to be prosperous, maybe this person's prayer may be dominated with asking God for more wealth, more prosperity. Because oftentimes it's money or wealth that is associated with prosperity, and that is what helps in fulfillment of desires. So artharthi can also be translated as a seeker of wealth. Sometimes holding positions of power facilitates fulfillment of desires. So artharthi can also refer to one who seeks power at your workplace or power in any other different situations in life. So this artharthi will encompass all these seeking for prosperity, seeking for wealth, seeking for power. In itself, there's nothing wrong with this. He's just pointing out the categories that if we turn to God primarily for the fulfillment of these things, then we belong to this category. And as I said, these are not watertight categories. We might find traits of many of these in our lives. Now, some people may realize that or may not realize, most of us don't realize that desire occurs because of lack of fulfillment. If you are fulfilled in every way, then there should be no desire in heart. But we find that desires keep on rising in our heart. Now, when will this desire end, if at all? And there are many stories, both in history and mythology, and of course, we might see that in our own lives and the lives of people around us as well. There is one well-known story in the Bhagavata, it comes, and many other sources as well, of a story of a king named Yayati. And so this king lived, well, being a king, he lacked nothing, and he led a very enjoyable life. All the pleasures were at his disposal. But then a time came, as eventually the king got old, and we know that old age means the vitality of the body and mind becomes less and less and less as we age. And therefore, this king, when he realized he had become so old that he no longer can enjoy life the way he did when he was young, and he became profoundly disappointed, profoundly depressed. So his youngest son saw how depressed his father was. And then he realized the reason that he could not deal with the reality of old age. And the story goes on to say, this youngest son must have been really a very mature son. So he goes to his father and says, I can't bear to see you so depressed and so sad. If youth is all that you want, I'm ready to exchange. Give me your aging profile and I will pass on my youth to you. Now don't ask me how they did it. This is the story. But what he said is, and look at it. He's a father. He could have asked his son and said, no, I've had my time, you now enjoy. But such was the intensity of desire. I don't know what he felt in his heart but he agreed to that. And so this young son took the old age of his father, and then this father became young again. And once again, he's all these desires bubbling up in his heart. He again indulged himself in all of those desires. But again, of course, he's not going to remain young forever. So he became old a second time. And then he discovered that his desires had not reduced even a little. That even having almost like a second life, his still desires hadn't reduced. And then he come to this very amazing insight. It's a beautiful verse that is often quoted in many contexts. Na jatu kama kamanam upabhogena shamyati havisha krishna vartmeva bhuya eva abhivardhate. Which simply means desires cannot end by the fulfillment of desires. Because once a desire gets fulfilled, there is a desire to replicate that experience, to kind of have it for a longer time, to kind of have a repeat of that. So fulfilling a desire, this verse says, Havisha Krishna Vartmeva, it's almost like pouring ghee in fire. So the more we keep on adding fuel in fire, the fire is never going to go out. It's always going to remain. And so sometimes we do think, oh, this is just one thing I want, and once I get it, I'm going to be at peace. And it never happens. I get it, I'm happy, but then there's always something else comes up, or I want one more of that. And so desires will not end through fulfillment. A third kind of a seeker, he is called the jidnyasu. Jidnyasu means one who is seeking knowledge, one who is disappointed because of ignorance. Now, in some ways, we can say that the knowledge seeker is a little bit more evolved than the first two, because the first two are primarily dealing with our physical and mental appetites. But somehow, the seeking after knowledge is the intellectual pursuits are in some ways, we could say, the world of ideas, the world of thoughts, is in some ways purer, more refined than this material world. And therefore, the hunger for knowledge drives this person to seek God's help. And we can see that. If someone wants to know, there is a limit to how much we can know. If we go to a library, you might see hundreds of volumes there and books. It can be overwhelming. It can also be, we can see, I'm still happy without reading any of these. So we know that life still goes on even if we don't know. But if we want to study them, we see that our time is limited. How much our brain can absorb is limited. So we don't have answers to all the questions, but even if the answers were available, we don't have the time and energy to absorb them all. So those who seek God to find answers to some of these, nowadays we might think with AI available, we don't need God anymore, okay? But AI can give many of the answers that we seek, although there is no guarantee that all of them would be very accurate. But the questions to some of the fundamentals of life, which perhaps are not available in any book, besides theories and speculations, if someone can turn to God, realizing that these basic ignorance that I have in my heart can only go through God's grace. And so that person is called jidnyasu. We see that how it gets manifest in many of the ancient texts. When they started writing a book, there was also what they call a Mangalacharanam. The very first verse was always about a salutation to the divine, seeking the divine help so that what is written, what is studied, is done with clarity and understanding. And so remembering of the divine before any activity has become a part of spiritual life of many people. So these are the first three. And the fourth one, he says, is jnani. Now, I like to translate that jnani as a spiritual seeker, because this person is not simply disappointed because of physical or mental pain, or disappointed because the desires are not fulfilled, or disappointed because they don't have answers to many of the questions. But this person is disappointed with the world as it is, world itself. What this fourth category, spiritual seeker, realizes that the body and the mind, wonderful as these instruments are, they are not perfect. That it's a defective product, if you like. Now, normally, if you order something from Amazon and if it's defective, they take it back and you can send it back. Unfortunately, here it doesn't work. Even when we recognize this is the defective product, we don't want it to be recalled. Partly because we don't know, partly because we don't know what's afterwards. So we then make peace with whatever this instrument that we have. So what this fourth category is seeking is not seeking God's help to fulfill something in this world. The disappointments are not related for things in the world, but with the world itself. So I'll briefly mention this. I've said this on earlier occasions, that sorrow or disappointment can be at two levels. One is the sorrow and disappointment we have seen of these first three categories, related with our body, with our mind, with our desires, with the things that we need but don't have. That's one kind of a sorrow. But deep down, if we are able to remain relatively unaffected or somehow ignore these kind of ups and downs of daily life, we might see that there is a deeper kind of sorrow. And though that sorrow springs from the reality of life that cannot be changed, that sorrow is truly universal, because no one is exempt from that sorrow. And that sorrow is basically what Krishna in the Gita refers to as Janma Mrityu Jara Vyadhi Dukkha Dosha Anudarshanam. Dosha, that's a defect. And which is that? It's simply that life as we understand it is sandwiched between birth and death, Janma Mrityu, Jara, the reality of aging, and Vyadhi, illness. No one is exempt from it. I mean, we're not even just talking about human beings. Any living being, animals, plants, everything that is living goes through this. At some point there is birth, there is death, there is aging, and there is illness. And all of these things are associated with pain, with sorrow, with suffering. Even, we might say, well, birth is a time of enjoyment. It's fun. Everyone celebrates when the baby is born. But everyone is celebrating, the baby is crying. The very first thing the baby does is cry. And in fact, if the baby doesn't cry immediately after birth, everyone's worried. And so in fact, a lot of times in some of these traditional stories, everyone's like waiting outside as the time for the baby to be born arrives. And only when they hear the cry of the child, baby crying, then they start celebrating, the family starts celebrating. It's kind of sad in some ways that the first thing we do after being born is cry. And crying is associated with life. If you don't cry, then is it stillborn? And so on. And so crying, we start our life with crying, and then of course, as we grow older, life gives us a lot more opportunities to cry now and then. And so the crying, not just for what we have or what we don't have, but we see that the reality of illness, aging, creates this often We might try to not think about it, and most of us, these are not very pleasant subjects to discuss, but deep down, we all know it happens because we see that in the families. We have our parents, grandparents, we see them, of course, but not everyone immediately says, well, that's who I am going to be like after a few years. And it's good to recognize that because that would kind of bring a little bit of more maturity in our lives. So this fourth category, the spiritual seeker, is not seeking God because I want this or I want that to remove my pain or remove my suffering. This person seeks God out of pure love. And that is what bhakti really is. That seeking God because I love God. Because sometimes we see people get upset, angry, people get disappointed when they pray for something and they don't get it. And then some people say, what's the use of praying? I'm not going to pray. I'm not going to church. I'm not going to temple anymore because it doesn't work. Now that's the kind of a transactional relationship sometimes people have with God. That I'll give all my love to God. I'll give all these things if God in return gives all those things to me. If God doesn't do God's part, then no, then I'm done with it. No, that's not bhakti. A spiritual seeker is one who says, I just love God. There is in the Mahabharata, I don't know whether it's actually in the written version or it's an oral tradition, there is the story about Yudhishthira, the eldest of the Pandavas, when Draupadi asks him, because he was seen as a very religious person who spent a lot of time in prayer and so on. So Draupadi, his wife, once asks him, why do you love God so much? Because they were really passing through a very tough time. And yet he was praying every day. And so she asks him, why do you pray for God so much? What has God done for you? And then he goes near the window and looks out at the Himalayas there. Then he tells his wife, look at these Himalayas. They make me so happy. I love them. The Himalayas have not done anything for me. They don't give me anything. They don't solve my problems. I just love them because they are who they are. Now that's the highest kind of a bhakti. If we see ourselves as devotees, that I love God because I love God, not because God gives me this or that. Now that's the highest category of devotion. And that is why Krishna in the next verse says, Tesham jnani nitya yukta eka bhaktihi vishishyate. He says, all of these four categories are dear to me, but the spiritual seeker, the last category, is special. Now, what is it that distinguishes this last category from the first three? First is, the spiritual seeker is seeking nothing of this world. Now, let me make this clear. There are two kinds of, sometimes devotion or bhakti itself is divided into two types. One is called sakama bhakti, the other is called nishkama bhakti. So asking God to fulfill our material wants is not bad, it's not wrong, it's not like a crime. It's fine. After all, if we see ourselves as children of God, and God is our divine parent, where else would children go and ask if they want something than to their father or mother? So asking God for these things is not in itself wrong or bad. What we need to ask is, do I love God because God may give these things to me? Or what will my relationship with God change if I ask something from God and God does not give it to me? It's like if I ask something from my mother or my father and my father says no, that father doesn't stop being my father. Even after saying no, he's still my father. So how do I see my relationship with God? That's something we have to ask. And secondly, the spiritual seeker turns to God not as a means of fulfillment, but as the goal itself. And that is why the Gita says, God is dear to the spiritual seeker, and the spiritual seeker is dear to God. Priyohi jnaninotyartham aham sacha mama priyaha. So now, so these four categories. First, Artha, one who is seeking relief from physical or mental pain. Jidnyasu, one who is seeking relief from the pain of not knowing or answers to questions. Then Artharthi, one who is seeking, who is disappointed with lack of fulfillment of desires and seeking God's help for that. And the fourth one is one who is seeking God for God's sake. Now, of these four, the fourth one, Krishna says, is special because that person is not seeking God as a means but as an end. Now, the first three, it's possible that eventually, at some point in their spiritual evolution, we will realize that, yes, if I have a severe headache, it's fine to say a prayer and say, God, please remove my headache. And it might work. And we can be very happy about that. But sometimes we realize it's like asking God to remove our headache is like if you go to a billionaire or if you go to a king. In olden example, they often they call it king. Not that many kings remaining in the world anymore. So let's say you go to a billionaire and that person says, ask whatever you want. Now, if and there's a guarantee that that person can give me whatever I ask for, then what will I ask for? Obviously, we have to ask for what that person can give. Now, if that person, if I say, could I have a little 1 pound of eggplants or something like that? Now, of course, that person will give it to me, but that person can give me much more. So all of these things we ask God for, God can give a trillion times more than that. So some time or the other, these first three categories may realize that it's wonderful that all these desires are getting fulfilled, but I can actually get a lot more. Speaking about desires getting fulfilled, I just want to mention one small little incident, which is very counterintuitive in some ways. So this happened sometime in the 1940s. We have a center in Bangalore in India, Mangaluru now. So the Swami there, his name was Swami Tyaganandaji. And of course, he's passed away now. He's very, very elderly, very senior Swami. He was very austere, very scholarly, extremely austere. I'm not saying him. I've just heard this about him. So Bangalore in those days, I mean, it was before global warming became what it is now. I mean, so Bangalore used to be, by Indian standards, fairly cold in winter. And so during winter, it was very cold. And so one of the members of the center there, he realized it's so cold. And he knew the Swami there didn't have any warm blanket. And so he was worried the whole night because what will happen? How will the Swami deal with that cold? So next early morning, he got a new woolen blanket and took it to the center and offered it to the Swami. He said, last night was so cold and the next few days are going to be so cold. So here is this blanket for you. Now, what had happened was that previous night, this Swami, before he went to bed, he actually, of course, he saw it was cold. He felt cold. And just a passing thought had come to his mind. Oh, I wish there was something warm to cover me. But of course, then he went to sleep. And next day morning, this person comes with a nice woolen blanket. So just a desire rose in his heart. And next morning, he didn't go and ask anybody for it. He didn't even pray to God for it. Just the thought came, oh, it will be nice to have something warm. And the desire got fulfilled the next morning. Now, how would any of us react to that? And the most natural reaction, it would seem, would be, you needed something, and before you even asked for it, somehow, in a most unexpected way, it has come to you. Now, a religious person might say, oh, God answered my prayer. God knew exactly what I wanted. Just the thought in my heart, and God saw that and God gave it to me. And we would be happy, we would be grateful, and so on. But interestingly, in this Swami's mind, It was a very, very counterintuitive reaction. As soon as that blanket came, he was terrified, first of all. So, of course, he thanked the person for bringing it, and after the person left, he was shaking. So he takes that blanket, he goes into the shrine, holds it before the altar, and he just spends a lot of time crying there. And now we might say, why? And his thinking was this. He said, God's grace was not that the blanket came the next day because of the desire in his heart, but that, he said, I'm so relieved. God's grace was that I desired nothing more than simply this blanket. If some worldly desire had come in my heart, and if that had gotten fulfilled, that would be the end of his spiritual life. And so he said, God's grace was that the only desire that came was for a warm blanket. Now, this story, what we learn from this is God's grace is shown to us not by the prayers that are answered, but actually that God's love is shown to us more by the prayers that are not answered. Or the other way is to say, prayers that are answered with a no. I ask something for God and God says no, which obviously means I don't get it. Most of us don't know what's good for us. There are a lot of things we think in our life, this is good for me. In retrospect, we feel relieved, like, thank God I didn't have that, because it may not have been good for me. And so that's how a devotee or a bhakta thinks, that when I pray for something, whether I get it or not, that's an act of love. That God will do only what is good for me. If I get it, that means God feels it is good for me, therefore God gave it to me. If I don't get what I ask for, then not getting it is good for me. That's the way a bhakta thinks. And so, udaraha sarva evaite, Krishna says in the Gita, that is, he says, all these four categories, they are noble. Udara, they are noble. Because irrespective of what is it that makes them turn to God, they chose to turn to God, that itself makes them noble. That instead of finding a worldly means to fulfill worldly desires, they try to find a religious, a spiritual source to which to turn to. Sri Ramakrishna says that when a little child is playing with toys, now and then, while the child, and then the example he gives is, mother is busy cooking in the kitchen, and to keep the baby engaged, she kind of puts a little toys around the baby so the baby can be playing those things and she can get the house chores done. And now and then, the baby might call out to mother and say, Ma, and so on. And the mother looks from the door and says, mother doesn't go. She says, the baby is still playing with the toys. But sometime or the other, the baby then, none of these toys interest the baby anymore. Then the baby starts really crying. And then that's the time when mother leaves everything in the kitchen and runs and picks up the baby. That's a beautiful example that Ramakrishna gives. To some extent, each one of us is that baby. Now and then, occasionally in our life, we might say, oh God, and we kind of read something and we pray occasionally. And we find, oh, I've not had any vision of God. God doesn't come. God doesn't come because I do occasionally call out to God and then become busy with my worldly toys again. But a time may come when none of these things will interest me anymore. When I'll cry. There is a beautiful song in Bengali which Ramakrishna used to sing, that if we cry in the right way, then the Divine Mother cannot stop herself from coming and giving her vision to us. So just a kind of a lackluster prayer to God doesn't work. When we pray, that prayer must come from the heart. It's not something that we do out of choice. It's something that we do because we wouldn't be able to do anything else. That's the idea. So a lot to lot to unpack here about disappointment. So I would encourage that it might be helpful to look at our own lives and see. You don't have to kind of review every little thing happened throughout our life. There are lots of things have happened in our lives, but kind of have a general overview about where our lives have brought us so far, going as far back as you can remember, that we have all had successes in our lives, we have all had disappointments in our life. And we can see, how have I as a person dealt with these successes, dealt with these disappointments, and have I learned anything in the way I have dealt with them? That the way I dealt with some of these things 5 years ago and 10 years ago, if similar things were going to happen to me right now, would I deal with them in the same way, or would I deal with them a little differently? That's the way to know whether something is changing here or not, whether real improvement in our life is occurring or not. And that's essentially what progress in spiritual life means. It's not to be measured simply by how long I'm sitting and meditating, or how many visions I had, or how many kind of dreams I have seen. It's more about, am I, first of all, as a human being, am I able to deal with these realities of life in a more mature way than what I did 5 or 10 years ago? That's the way to know whether my life is going in the right direction. And that's something we all have to do, just to make sure that we are doing the right thing. Because a mechanical life, just doing everything because everyone is doing it, that kind of a herd complex, as sometimes they call it, just living like sheep, just following whatever others are doing, I'm doing. At some time or the other, we might feel our life has become very hollow, very superficial. And sometimes so much time may go by and we might see, oh, what have I done? I should have taken these things seriously. And time once lost will never come back. And that's why, if we are able to harvest our disappointments well, then it's like this. When all these organic trash that's sent out, we can either throw it in trash and it'll go away. Or sometimes people then compost it and make a manure out of it. And through that manure, if you put it in the garden, some wonderful, colorful, beautiful, fragrant flowers may come out of that. So similarly, disappointments, setbacks, failures can occur in the lives of us all. What we do with them, can we harvest them out of that disappointment, out of those failures, out of those setbacks? Can I become more mature, build up a life that will make me a blessing to myself, and then a blessing to the people around me as well? So these are some of the thoughts I thought I could share with you this morning. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu.